Lila had always loved flea markets. The thrill of rummaging through old trinkets, the possibility of unearthing a hidden gem, and the stories whispered through antiques thrilled her. On a crisp October morning, she wandered through the crowded aisles of the Cedarville flea market. The air smelled of fried dough and damp leaves, mingling with the distant hum of conversations and laughter. It was at the back corner of the market, tucked away between a rusted phonograph and a stack of cracked porcelain plates, that Lila spotted it, a vintage camera. Its black leatherette body was worn but intact, and its brass fittings glinted faintly in the weak sunlight. A small, engraved plate on the top read, Eterna Model 13. "How much for this?" Lila asked the stall owner, a gaunt man with silver hair and an unsettlingly blank expression. He eyed her for a moment, then said, $50, no haggling. She hesitated but felt an inexplicable pull. Handing over the cash, she tucked the camera into her bag and continued browsing, unaware of the shadow she'd just let into her life. That evening, Lila sat at her desk, turning the camera over in her hands. It felt heavier than it looked, the weight almost unnatural. There was no brand she recognized, and an online search for Eterna Model 13 yielded nothing but dead ends. Still, she couldn't wait to try it out. She loaded the camera with film and stepped outside. The sunset bathed her quiet neighborhood in hues of amber and crimson, and she snapped a picture of the empty street. Click. The mechanical sound of the shutter was oddly satisfying. When she developed the film in her makeshift darkroom, her breath hitched. The photo showed the street just as she'd seen it, but there was something else. Standing in the middle of the road was a translucent figure, barely visible but undeniably there. A woman, dressed in a flowing gown, her face turned away from the camera. "Must be a trick of the light," Lila muttered, though unease prickled her skin. The next few days, Lila took the camera everywhere. She photographed her cat lounging in a sunbeam, the bustling coffee shop downtown, and the park near her house. Each roll of film she developed revealed more anomalies. A pale-faced child peering from behind a tree, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of an otherwise empty room, and, most disturbingly, a man with hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. The apparitions weren't just eerie, they were wrong. Their poses and expressions didn't fit the scenes. The child looked frightened, the man angry, the woman forlorn. Lila's unease deepened when she noticed another pattern. Each ghostly figure seemed to be closer to her with every roll of film. Then the accidents began. It started small. The day after Lila photographed the park, she heard on the news that a jogger had been injured when a tree branch snapped unexpectedly. She didn't think much of it until she revisited the photo. The spectral child was no longer peeking from behind the tree. He was directly beneath the branch, arms raised as if reaching for help. A photo of the coffee shop showed the hollow-eyed man standing behind a barista, his hand resting on her shoulder. The next morning, Lila learned the barista had suffered severe burns when the espresso machine malfunctioned. The connections were too clear to dismiss. Terrified, Lila stopped taking photos, shoving the camera into a drawer. But her nights were plagued by vivid nightmares of the ghost, the woman crying, the man screaming, the child whispering words she couldn't understand. Unable to ignore the camera's pull, Lila decided to test a theory. She visited a desolate stretch of road at sunset, setting the camera on a tripod. With trembling hands, she clicked the shutter, capturing the empty expanse. She developed the photo that night, heart pounding as the image came to life. There, in the center of the road, was the woman in the gown. But this time, her head was tilted up and her face was visible eyes hollow, mouth twisted in a silent scream. A car hurtled toward her, its headlights piercing the dark. Lila's blood ran cold. She hadn't seen a car when she took the photo. 2 days later, news broke of a fatal accident on that very road. A car had swerved to avoid what the driver described as a figure in white and crashed into a ditch. Lila's hands shook as she clutched the newspaper. The deaths were happening because of her photos, or worse, because the camera wanted them to. Lila tried to destroy it. She smashed it with a hammer, but the brass fittings didn't dent. She threw it into a river, only to find it waiting on her desk the next morning, perfectly dry. Desperation clawed at her chest. Convinced the camera wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted, Lila decided to confront it. She set it on her desk, staring into its cold, unblinking lens. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The room seemed to darken, the air growing heavy. She felt an invisible force guiding her hands as she loaded the camera with its last roll of film. A sense of inevitability washed over her as she raised it and pointed it at herself. Click. The shutter sound echoed like a death knell. When Lila developed the photo, her legs gave out beneath her. The image showed her sitting at her desk, staring wide-eyed at the camera. Behind her loomed all the ghosts from the previous photos: the child, the woman, the man, and dozens more she'd never seen before. Their spectral hands reached for her, their faces twisted in rage and despair. When Lila developed the photo, her legs gave out beneath her. The image showed her sitting at her desk, staring wide-eyed at the camera. Behind her loomed all the ghosts from the previous photos: the child, the woman, the man, and dozens more she'd never seen before. Their spectral hands reached for her, their faces twisted in rage and despair. As she stared, the figures seemed to shift, moving ever so slightly on the paper. Her reflection in the glossy surface smirked, though her real face was frozen in terror. Then the lights in her house flickered and died. A week later, Lila's neighbors reported her missing. Her house was eerily silent, her belongings untouched except for the camera, which sat neatly on her desk. A curious officer picked it up, admiring its vintage design. "Maybe I'll try a shot," he mused. Click.